For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and culturally. Deep in the abyss of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other-than-human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. I invite you to go with me down the rabbit hole as I seek out the silenced, forgotten, buried, abandoned, and demonized stories and practices of regenerative, egalitarian, place-based cultures. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationships to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, the traditional territory of the Multnomah and Clackamas Chinookan people, as well as the Kalapuya, Molalla, Cowlitz, and many other tribal groups whom have lived here, subsisted here, and traveled here to trade and make their living since time immemorial. This podcast is produced in partnership with Rewild Portland, a nonprofit organization, and is made possible through financial support from our patrons on Patreon. Thank you. If you feel inspired by this podcast, please subscribe, share it on social media, and write a review on Apple Podcasts. The best way to keep the podcast going is to become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. 7 in 10 Americans identify as Christian. For a movement like Rewilding to gain more traction, it must intersect with the belief systems of the culture at large on some level. I am not a Christian, though I am interested in the intersection of Rewilding and Christianity. Since I live in the United States, I feel it's important to understand enough about the dominant culture here and where to find common ground in Rewilding narratives. In this episode, I chat with two friends of mine who are both pastors, Solveig Nilsen-Goodin and Aric Clark. Solveig is an ordained pastor in the Lutheran Church, a spiritual director, grief coach, writer, author of the book What is the Way of the Wilderness? An Introduction to the Wilderness Way Community, and co-editor and contributor to A Grounded Faith, Reconnecting with Creator and Creation in the Season of Lent. Solveig helped found EcoFaith Recovery and founded and pastored the Wilderness Way Community for 11 years. She and her husband, Peter, are raising 2 teenage boys in Northeast Portland. Reverend Aric Clark is a pastor of Mount Home and Sherwood United Methodist Churches. He is also a writer, a speaker, and an activist who lives in Portland, Oregon. He is the co-author of Never Pray Again, Lift Your Head, Unfold Your Hands, and Get to Work, a book that challenges readers to embrace a concrete, other-centered spirituality, and editor of Faithful Resistance, Gospel Visions for the Church in a Time of Empire. When not pastoring, writing, or protesting, he is parenting 2 teenagers and indulging a love of tabletop gaming. Our conversation topics range from anarchism, feminism, death, grief, decolonization, and the histories of the church, the challenges of working in institutions, and much more. All right. Well, thank you for coming on to the Rewilding podcast.
Glad to be here. Yeah. Thanks, Peter.
This is the first one I think I've officially had 2 people in the podcast aside from myself. So it'll be interesting to see how this flows. And I just kind of wanted to start out by just sort of joking about how I sent both of you this list of questions around some more like basic concepts around Rewilding Christianity, and Aric was just like, "No, those are boring." And I was like, yeah, no, you're totally right. Those are fucking boring. Let's just skip past some of that stuff. So I don't want to get into like, what is Christianity and all of that kind of stuff. I think that's too basic for the level that we want to have a conversation on. So I think I'll just start out by asking both of you, and we'll start with you, Solveig. What is rewilding to you, and how does it blend with your spiritual practices?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, as an interesting story. I was listening to your podcast about rewilding last night, Peter, and I was reminded about how the word rewilding came to you and how it really impacted you when you heard it. You're like, yeah, that's it. Well, I had a similar experience in the early days of the community that I started and led for about 11 years, Wilderness Way community. And, in one of the, dozens of times we gathered to, listen for, okay, what is it that we're doing and whatnot. And we did this exercise of like going through magazines, and like cutting out pictures and what resonated with us. Anyway, I saw the word rewilding. There was an article on rewilding in there, and I started crying inexplicably. And so Rewilding Christianity, it struck a chord, a very deep chord in me. And what it really, it means a lot of things, as you know, right? Mm-hmm. But to me, it speaks to that piece of becoming untamed by this from this institution that has functioned to tame, to control, and institution widely defined, obviously, and widely experienced in different ways. And so Wilderness Way, explicitly in our practice, we explicitly said we're creating a space for us to be undomesticated, untamed, which meant lots of different things, right? It meant like doing our own like story autobiographical work, right? To find like our own power, to remember who we are, right? And that we're bigger than this institution that tries to dictate the narrative, right? And it means grappling with these stories and how we read them, and how we've been tamed into reading them, and how the narratives themselves have been so tamed, that we can read this completely rad story narrative, in the scripture and think it's just about like being nice, right? Like, what? How did that happen? So I think that's kind of at the heart of it for me, is what and how can we undomesticate and untame ourselves, to find the true power, paradoxically, of this faith tradition.
Yeah.
So that's a piece. There's cool. More, but I'll invite Aric to
awesome.
to put your 2 cents in there.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter, for inviting us to be here, inviting me to be part of this conversation. As I have engaged with the concept of rewilding and how it intersects with my self-understanding as a Christian, as a pastor, I come to Christianity fundamentally as a rebel, as an anarchist. Like, I read the scriptures and I read the tradition as anti-imperial and anti-hierarchy and anti structures of power and oppression. And I also, that's my orientation as well in broader public life. But I think that one of the challenges that's true for people who, are kind of of an anarchist bent like me is that we're raised up in a culture and in a society that's, completely severed us from any groundedness or rootedness, which could inform that rebellion for being something other than just sort of like a reactionary, against all the bullshit that we see around us, so like revolution and rebellion and anarchy carry these connotations in our culture of just sort of like childishness and rejection and just reactionary response to all the time. And I think that's it's obviously a limited framework. It's obviously limited if you're going to if your starting place is just a rejection of, and you don't have something to affirm, some context in which you can situate yourself, which is healthy, which is life-giving. And as such, I think it's important for us to try to find that. And what rewilding offers, I think, particularly to this narrative, is as a sense of like the greater context, which is true for like just in a literal physical biological sense. Like we are animals, we are creatures as part of an environment. We are, we evolved in a place in connection with other creatures and other things that live in that place. And that sort of like base level truth and reality is something that can enable us to sort of recover a context from which we can critique things that need to be torn down and destroyed without just being reactionary, like with some strong sense of like how we fit and how we belong. Wildness is carries this connotation of like, will and self ordering, like the idea of being able to decide for yourself who you want to be and how you want to be. But it also is an acknowledgement of like a web, a context of coexistence. And so like, for me, that makes sense to say that enables a form of Christianity, which can be really radical and really critical of forms and structures of oppression, but which is not just inherently reactionary, but which is rooted in a greater interdependence of life. And that makes it, sustainable and something that doesn't, you don't burn out, and you don't also just, go down wild hair paths of rebelling or reacting against whatever is currently of the moment seems to be the most intense provocation.
So it's interesting listening. I mean, I know I've had lots of conversations with both of you around some of these things. And I think one of the big questions I have is like, how did you, I was born into a family that went to church. It was a Presbyterian church for the first 5 or 6 years of my life. And then my mom switched and we went to a Methodist church for the next 5 or 6 years. I don't remember ever having any kind of the kinds of thoughts around this or being taught in terms of my own upbringing around Christianity, that it could have this sort of radical anarchist bent to it. And so I'm curious, like, was that something that you were born into, that maybe your families had, or was there a particular moment where you were like identifying as a Christian and you were like, actually, what I've been told about this isn't the way that I think I should be perceiving it? Or do you know what I'm asking? Like, how did you go from sort of what I think mainstream concepts of Christianity or sort of the bigger perceptions of like these different sort of institutions of power themselves, how did you go from that to this other perspective, right? And let's start with Solveig, and then we'll go to Aric.
Yeah. Well, I consider myself lucky to, I was raised in Lutheran Church, Midwest. So nothing crazy, left of center. And with a lot of joy in that community and in that faith structure, and a lot of realness. And so I feel really grateful that my roots have life in them, right? It wasn't just like the rote dead going to church that many people experience, or super controlling, right? So there was some juiciness there, right? There was some life there. Did it have anything to do with rewilding? Not really, except that, it was in the 70s and, my mom helped start the co-op, and, there was homemade everything and, all that kind of stuff too, which actually mattered.
Totally.
Right. That helped form my consciousness as well. And it was still for, a liturgical upbringing, all the words, we're all getting seeped in to my consciousness. So there was, for me, the beginning of the shift was really around a faith crisis around feminism, and having the the patriarchy of the church being unveiled to me in deeper ways, and the scripture, in really like traumatic, really difficult ways. So entering into, fortunately being given it, this is in college, in a context where I could enter into, essentially feminist thought. So this is like in the late 80s. So this is what first, second wave feminism. So I'm being taught by first wave feminists. And it was a particular book, actually, by a biblical scholar, feminist biblical scholar, Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, who's like the GOAT of feminist biblical interpretation. Totally amazing. And anyway, this book was called Bread Not Stone, and it was kind of my first primary visceral introduction to, I don't have to just take this shit, right? Like I can have a conversation with it. Well, that then ending up being able to study with her in divinity school, and just like blowing my mind open around feminist, ecofeminist, the whole world opened up in that way. So, so I think that was the moment that Christianity, I say that like Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza like saved Christianity for me, in that way. And there's all these, women and men alike, but mostly women doing this work, doing this scholarship, and landing all the way across the spectrum, right? Like, no way, that is absolutely irredeemable, right? To people who would say, well, okay, one little story about Elizabeth, because it's essentially why I'm still in the church today, and because it's about power and sphere of influence. So it was my first year of divinity school, and I was just like in a brown bag lunch, with like new students, and she's, doing introductions, and so we're going around and saying, what's our program and what's our denomination, whatever. So I say, well, I'm here, I'm in the MDiv program, and I grew up Lutheran, and I think I want to be a pastor, but I'm not really sure. If I am, I'm not sure what denomination I'll be. If I'm not, I'm not sure if I'll even stay in the Christian church. Yeah, I mean, I didn't even know, right? And she looks me straight in the eye and just says, well, if I were you, if you choose to be a pastor, I would stay a Lutheran, because as soon as you leave, you've given them the power to define you out.
Yeah.
So I'm still a Lutheran.
Yeah.
And I still claim the word Christian, right? Like you still claim the word rewilding, because there's still enough there,
Yes.
there, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And you haven't let the other, rewilding
Totally.
definers define
Exactly.
you out, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. This is kind of an ignorant question, but what is divinity school?
Oh.
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
It's where you learn to be divine, Peter. I mean, isn't that true, Aric?
Seminary,
Yeah.
essentially. It's postgraduate education for people going into professional ministry.
Right. But a divinity school is different from a seminary in the sense that it's not, we're not fundamentally denominationally oriented, right? So it's not like there's one track, right? It was people doing PhDs, THDs, studying world religions, doing all kinds of inquiry. So
Awesome.
there you go.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. For myself,
Aric.
I came to the church, like my family has roots in the church going way back. I have Presbyterian ministers, my grandfather and his father and their brothers, and all the way going back multiple generations in there. There was kind of an expectation that being involved in the church was part of that. But my father had grown up for that reason as a pastor's kid and was kind of burned out on church. And so actually didn't really take me to church as a kid. I didn't really attend church except like Christmas and Easter. I had this vague notion that we were Christians, but I didn't really personally engage with it or identify with it very closely. I read, Daniel Quinn long before I ever read the Gospels, and had already like kind of staked out some of my political identity as an anarchist and such before I had come to my understanding of self as a person of faith. And that came through conversations. I was traveling in my undergrad studying anthropology and ethnology. I was studying different religious communities from an anthropological perspective. Like I was observing religious rituals and stuff and writing about it and part of that. And I got questions from participants in some of those rituals. I had a Dharma master, a Buddhist teacher in Taiwan, who asked me if I wanted to convert to Buddhism. And when I said no, I didn't think so, as much as I respected and I admired their tradition, I didn't think it was something I personally was interested in. And he said, well, that's good because you'd be a terrible Buddhist. But he said, you clearly are someone who's like seeking something, someone who's looking for something. And my advice to you is that, if you're trying to get across a lake or an ocean, a body of water, you can't do it by having one foot in one boat and one foot in another boat. Eventually you have to pick a boat, climb in and row. And he's like, so figure out what your tradition is and go and commit to it. And, there's lots of seaworthy boats, but you just got to figure out which boat is going to work for you and get yourself on the journey, or you'll never make it across. So I came back and I really engaged with my Christian roots and tradition, tried to explore it. But when I came to the church, I came to it pretty antagonistically. I came to it going, the church is this like dull museum of an institution for people who want a social club on Sunday mornings and who have, politics that are center right that support a whole bunch of stuff that I abhor. And, I just didn't see, and that squelched like intellectual inquiry and curiosity. And like, I had a lot of reservations coming to the church. And it was actually through like the discovery of some of the early 20th century anarchists, the Catholic worker movement and, some of the stuff like that I was like, okay, there are some people here who still take these narratives, see these narratives and use these narratives in ways that are compelling to me. But also it was engaging with some, Eastern Orthodox monks and others who like clearly weren't afraid of questions, weren't afraid of like having their beliefs challenged, and were able and willing to engage with science and all sorts of things outside the sphere of quote theology, that gave me the permission to sort of like look deeper and to see if there wasn't possibility here for this. And so that kind of got me like permission to explore and permission to go in and seek where there might be value here. But what for me has ultimately kept me here, kept me as claiming Christianity as an identity and as a role, is an awareness that, similar to the way I answered that first question, that like capitalism and colonialism have so thoroughly cut us off from deep, meaningful rootedness that in some ways, these older religious traditions like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism and stuff are as close as many of us in a settler colonial world have to ancestral memory, to ancestral knowledge. And that these ancestral traditions are a way of being in conversation with people who are also struggling against violence and oppression in the past. Without that tradition, I see a lot of, it's not that I don't think you can carve out for yourself an authentic, well-lived life without those roots of tradition, but I think that the tradition is helpful in that process. I think that most of us who don't have a self-aware claimed form of spiritual belief actually construct for ourselves spiritual beliefs that are often pretty self-destructive and anemic. Like they lack the depth necessary to sustain the kind of struggle that's necessary to work against powerful forces of oppression. And so I think there's value to being humble enough to say, I need some form of connectedness with this past, with this root, in order to be able to have perspective on how I'm going to continue to struggle in the present.
Yeah. Awesome. I mean, it makes me think of, like, I mean, the closest thing I can kind of think of that's sort of not, it's not a closest thing, but what it's making me think of is like reconstructionism or whatever, reconstructionism, I don't know. I've had a lot of caffeine today. Of like Druid, the so-called Druidic religion or something as this sort of pagan thing when really nobody knows what Druids were at all. And I'm curious, I mean, it relates to that in the sense that I'm curious about the complexity there of like the history of Christianity being leveraged as a tool by the state to explicitly oppress others. And is there anything that either of you do in your work that is, reconciling that history or, an attempt to undo that framework?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I can think of an immediate example of something I'm doing right now that's part of that. So I'm a Presbyterian, which means I'm part of a denominational body that has like these regional sections called presbyteries. So presbytery is the local governing body of the church in this area. And our local governing body has, as many other church groups have, wrestled with the fact that we have some churches that are aging or closing or dealing with what to do with the situation of properties that are accumulating empty church buildings and things like that. This property, of course, was like overwhelmingly or entirely essentially gained through processes of colonialism, right? Like the church was a forerunner, one of the very first institutions to participate in colonialism. Usually a town would get started in the American West and it would be like the general store, the bank, and the church were the first three buildings in the town, right? Like, and so everywhere throughout this country, there on every main street, there's a first something or other church that has probably been there since the 1880s or 1870s, and was literally just like, we took indigenous land and built a church on it and claimed it. And that property is now, in many cases, valuable real estate. That has been grandfathered in through tax like benefits and things through the generations as well. So like there's all kinds of built up institutional power and privilege and wealth centered around participation in colonialism. So our presbytery has discerned that among the things that we're going to be doing with these properties is doing some land back work. So we have one property right now that's already in process. We have a partnership group that is entirely local native led folks that are wanting to use that property for a tiny house village and community center for people of native ancestry. And that is like, we're in partnership with them to basically figure out what's the best way. Like, do we just give the land? Do we give them a 100-year lease with $1 a year sort of situation? Because it depends on tax burdens and all the things that are part of that. But basically we're looking to figure out how to use these resources that we have in a way that is decolonizing and which is actively trying to build up community resources for the indigenous people whose land we stole and profited from.
Yep. And
Yeah.
Actually, Aric and I have talked about this. I had conversations about this as well, because I'm doing similar work in the Oregon Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. On our Synod reparations team, we're taking different approaches. They're farther along in some ways in the conversation, specifically around churches that are closing. That's a conversation that I have very much in my heart. I'll say something about that in just a minute, but one of the tools that has been developed through this Reckoning with Racism process is this land genealogy tool. So for any, faith community, but it could be anybody that has land, that quote unquote owns land, is this process of just uncovering the genealogy of the land. And with, based on the premise that if you don't know what harm has been done, you can't know what repair to do. So that's a process right now. Like today, I'm in the process of moving that, basically trying to move that to the entire ELCA. So like all the nation, the National Lutheran Church, to essentially recommend that every congregation, camp, college, school, whatever, anyone that has land, do this kind of land genealogy work. Again, just because if you don't know,
totally, yeah,
then the choices that you make are going to reflect that ignorance. So the other piece that I wanted to say about that is around one area of rewilding that has been growing in me. Really, well, I guess I'll say, like, another thing that really touched me was from Martin Pricktow, who I know that you love also, Peter. And in his book, The Smell of Rain on Dust, he quotes this decree number 22 of the Third Council of Toledo, right, 589 AD. So early church, not early church, actually, Constantinian church, right? Anyway, he says this is a direct quote from that council. The bodies of all religious who, called by God, depart from this life should be carried to the grave amid psalms and the voices of the chanters only, but we absolutely forbid burial songs, which are commonly sung for the dead, and the accompaniment of the corpse by the family and dependents of the deceased beating their breast. That it forbids grief. It forbids the most basic human response to love, which is grief, as a tool of colonialism. And so something, that's been stirring in me in these last few years is about creating spaces and acknowledging and making it safe to grieve as a means of rewilding. Because if the suppression of grief is a function of domination, then the process of liberation has to include grief. And
absolutely.
And it's connected to this piece, right? Because there's of all these churches that are closing, like we're at a time of the dramatic reduction in size of institutional Christianity, not just Christianity, but Christianity in our context. And so there's tremendous grief and legitimate, people give their lives to something that they love, right? And then it falls apart. But what, I love what Pricktow talks about is the process of metabolizing grief is, from a Christian perspective, it's how we move from death to resurrection, to use that, theological language. It's how we create more life in the world, is to metabolize that grief. So how can we really, grieve the end of colonial Christianity, let's say, colonizer Christianity, grieve that end by making something beautiful and redemptive for those who have borne the greatest brunt of that colonial process.
Yeah, awesome.
Well,
you made me think of.
I was going to briefly jump in there with Solveig. In addition to that, is that and making space for grief is I mean, not only necessary, of course, from a basic like human emotional trauma processing perspective, but also when you look at, for example, like the forms of denialism out there as it pertains to climate chaos and ecocide. The obvious one that people point to, of course, is the anti-scientific, sort of like ignorant denialism that just pretends that it isn't real. But I think the much more profound and real denialism, which is present just as much in the progressive spheres and such as it is on the right, is the form of denialism that's really a repression of grief. Like I'm not facing the gravity of the situation, not because I don't believe the scientific evidence for it or because I don't see the signs of it, but because I'm just unable to deal with the magnitude of the sorrow that I'm going to experience if I accept the reality that much of the life that shares this planet with us is already in a grave condition and is likely to get worse in the near-term future. And that's going to be a hardship for all of us. It's taboo to accept or acknowledge in any form of conversation, even in environmental activist circles, the idea that this process is going to involve some loss for us, that like we can't just green every energy and go on with life as it were, and that continue to have this consumer-based society. As long as we're using solar panels instead of fossil fuels, it'll be fine. Like there's this sort of like unwillingness to accept the idea that in fact death is going to be necessary, death is going to be inevitable part of this, and that's painful and merits a lamentation.
Yeah, and makes me think about, I was like driving through downtown Portland last year, and all of the businesses were like closed and boarded up, and there was graffiti everywhere, and I was like smiling, looking at looking at everything, and then it was like this super random thing that I never thought would have happened, which I was just like overwhelmed with sadness, and I was like, why am I so sad? This is so, like this is. On the one hand, like I've just known that the decline of civilization has been happening ever since I was 16, and waited for moments of collapse within the decline, and to see the city in such a state of collapse and decline, like I want to contrast that with like the first few weeks of the pandemic. I was driving down the freeway, and there was no traffic. And there's this huge sign, that says in giant letters, "Stay home, COVID-19," glowing letters. And I just started laughing hysterically in my car. And I was just like, this is finally here. This shit's finally happening. Things I've been expecting to happen for years and years. But then I'm like downtown Portland and I see this thing and I'm thinking, you know what? As much as I like critique civilization and understand how much it's destructive, there's this element of like, this is still the home I grew up in, this is still like what I know, and it made me think of like having an abusive parent or something, where like there's
totally
that's like gonna die, right, like on their deathbed or something, and you're not necessarily like, yeah, fuck you fuck you, you deserve to die or something, but you're like, you're still sad. I mean, it's still just like a sad situation. And in part because there is maybe no real reconciliation in that death, and potentially, where civilization is just inherently destructive and it's just going to come and it's going to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to look, go ahead.
And it's like losing a relative who you had a complex or even bad relationship with, right? Like if you had a toxic relationship with a relative, that death is complicated. And there's feelings of relief, feelings of finally, maybe feelings of there, but there's also feelings of loss and feelings of grief for the relationship you should have had, but didn't get to have.
Exactly.
And all of those things that are part of it. And
yes.
We don't deal well with that. We want to have grief be nice and simplistic. We want to have we often like eulogize people in a way that more or less sanctifies them, that only talks about what about them was admirable and never mentions anything about them that was negative. There's a common phrase, don't speak ill of the dead.
Mm.
And so when we have our civilization dying around us, and it's a frankly toxic, destructive civilization, and yet we're like, feel that feeling of grief because we're children of that civilization, reared by that civilization, and indebted to that civilization for our identity. And so there we feel feelings of loss and pain and sorrow, but also it's complicated by the recognition that it wasn't good, but we're not allowed to say anything bad about it afterwards because we're only supposed to focus on the good, now Rome looks beautiful if you visit it now, right? Like Rome
Right.
is just,
Yeah.
it's all white marble and picturesque settings and admiration for roads that have endured 2,000 years. Like, because there's no crosses by those roads. There's no, slave pits to investigate it with. The stench of the evil of Rome isn't with us anymore. Just the bones that are left behind that are beautiful. And so like there's an element of that with our civilization that people are tempted to wax poetic and lament all the beauty, which is real, but it's real embedded in all of this mess.
Totally.
Yeah.
One thing another kind of question that popped up for me in regard to like land back reconciliation, is this something that you feel, I mean, you're a member of Aric Presbyterian Church. Is that like, an institution that as a whole is like, yeah, we need to engage in this kind of stuff? Or is it like, individual groups are kind of allowed freedom to operate within whatever context? And what's your relationship with navigating being part of this larger institution with your own anarchic interpretation of the religion?
Yeah. Yeah, it's complicated. Are there elements of the institution that I think are genuinely in good faith attempting to engage this work? Yes, I do. Do I think that there's possibility for the institution as a whole to do some good work, meaningful work in this way? Yes, there was an apology for the doctrine of discovery and for participation in boarding schools a few years back, and there's been active reparation work post that. Financially and like relationship building wise, at various parts of the church. So I think there is possibility within the institution, at the same time as the institution is also this body that has, like around $18-20 billion invested in funds that are, in Wall Street, and that has a history of never having less than a 4% return over the past, 150 years. And being very effective at being basically very good at capitalism. Like it's an institution that's very good at doing capitalism, and a whole lot of people who are really invested in that idea of it and in the way of wanting to control it. It involves professional costs for me being vocal in the way I am. Even as I find certain places within the institution where I can gain leverage and gain support, there's also like, I'm probably never going to hold a full-time large church position within the institution because I'm just a little bit too outspoken about some things, which makes me, like they love to have me come as a guest speaker because they're like, Aric will get us thinking, but they don't want me as like
Right.
the like main institutional representative, right? Like they don't want me as the face of the institutional body in that respect.
Absolutely.
And so it's that sort of like you're ours, but kind of at arm's length sort of vibe that happens with within the institution.
Solveig, how does that reflect on you as well? Just, I don't know in terms of being a Lutheran, is it similar? Is it different? Because do you have to pay in or do you have buy-in into the larger institution of the Lutheran Church, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's super similar to Aric's situation. Complicated. When I started Wilderness Way, I was what they call on leave from call, which meant that I was still an ordained, I was still recognized as a pastor. But but getting no funding. Well, for the first 7 years of Wilderness Way, we got no funding. There was just like no recognition. It was just too kind of far out of the box. And then we did get some funding, and then ran into some really interesting, like, we love that you're doing this. We don't really want to know anything about it. Like, we love kind of claiming that we're innovative.
Right.
And
where does that leave, question for both of you too, where does that leave the people who attend, is it a parish? Is it a church? I don't know the lingo.
Sure.
The churchgoers, where does that leave the people who, are participants in your work?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting place, and again, the difference in cultures of each congregation, let's say, there's just a giant gamut, right? There's just a giant gamut. You've got, everything from, the folks who are really trying, honestly, legitimately, to reimagine how they can be Christian community in ways that don't perpetuate white supremacy and colonialism and capitalism, right? You have people that are really genuinely trying to figure that out. And then you have, faith communities that are just like, we have no idea how else to do this, nor do we really want to do this any other way. This is what it is. And so we'll hold on to this until it dies. We'll just hold on to it until it dies.
Yeah.
Yeah. Same for you, Aric.
Yeah. I think that we're pretty far along here in Portland on the pathway toward a sort of like post-Christian culture and dynamic. Like, no one comes to church in my churches out of a sense of like obligation in the way that maybe they do in other parts of the country. Like, very few people, they're aware that like there's no one judging them for what they do on their Sunday morning, right? Like, they can just as easily go for a hike or sleep in as come to church, or if they want to. Even now with COVID, even more so, because half the time church is just to click a button on your Zoom on your camera. So there isn't. So in that sense, if they're coming to church, there's probably something driving them there, something that's personal, that there's a reason why. Many times that'll be friendships, relationships within the church that have very little to do with a theology or claiming, but that are more about community. A lot of people who come to my congregations come because of the work we do in the community around hunger. And so like we have people who are either recipients of those ministries or participants in those ministries who are there because they care about making sure people in the community have food, and that's important to them, and they're part of that. But also I've really learned that in ministry that like the people who are in my congregation are really only like maybe a third of my people. Like, my people are also the people who I'm at, like many of whom would, by the way, at protests, who would never claim Christianity or a faith, in that way, as a personal identity, but nevertheless, like, I provide some benefit to or service to by my presence, by my willingness to be there to hear, by my, helping get someone out of a tear gas cloud or give someone a ride home or something, is just as important or just as valuable an expression of my vocation as a sermon that I might give on Sunday morning. And a lot of interactions I have, a lot of people come to me who are like, there's times in their life where they recognize or feel the need for someone who has a explicit religious vocation, but they don't have themselves a religious identity. And so they come to me because I'm the only person they know. They're like, hey, my father died and I don't have any background on this. I have no idea how to do a funeral. What do I do? Like, what do I do at a death situation? And then you're just being there for them in that period of their life where they feel the need for someone who has that religious aura about them, even if they themselves aren't wanting to claim a position in that tradition. And so like a lot of the times for me, it's recognizing that like that the boundaries are extremely porous, and that I hold this identity publicly, partly because so many of the people who I interact with don't know where they stand in relation to religion, and are, and therefore they, I can be someone for them who they can be like, okay, if I have a question that I feel like I need to talk to someone who has that background, then at least there's someone in my life who I've met who feels safe to talk to,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I had like 4 other questions, but I forgot what they were. And so I'm just going to jump to another question, sort of a larger question, which is, in terms of Jesus as a figure, as the central figure to Christianity, how do you, I guess I should sort of preface this with, in some of the explorations that I'm doing with Christianity, what I'm looking for are sort of rewilding heroes that kind of pop up within the framework, and, not necessarily mythological, but in a sense of like real people. It could be historical, it could be mythologized historical figures. But I often think that a lot of the religions that we have originate as a kind of anti-state anarchist, or a moral ethical quandary of how do we limit the state power, how do we limit power among people, and then that gets obviously just corrupted over time. And so I think about that a lot with Jesus, because I have heard things, I think from both of you, around that kind of idea that this person, and actually Phoenicia Madrano, training, aka Training Granny, she was, I think, maybe the first person who talked to me a lot about Jesus, as essentially a rewilding hero, and
Yep.
talking about going out, and she was always like, we're going to go spend 41 days in the wilderness because we're going to do one more than Jesus or whatever,
I love that.
But I think about that kind of stuff. Another character that I'm sort of looking at right now is Hildegard von Bingen, and I found her because actually I got into like the bardcore YouTube music craze last summer, and there was like a channel on there, and the channel was Hildegard von Blingen, and I was like, that's got to be like a reference to something, And so I Googled it and I started reading about her, and I was like, oh, wow, this is awesome. Like, and it doesn't really sound like what the things that she did were like super inspirational, and it sounded very much like witchy, it sounded very much like a witch, not like somebody I would think of as somebody from the church. And so anyway, she's just one example. But in terms of like Jesus, since he's the central figure of Christianity, like what do you see in him as a potential for this type of narrative? And Solveig, let's start with you.
For this type of narrative. Gosh, there's a lot of directions to go here. So I'm just going to pick one. Maybe Aric, you can pick up some other ones. So I'm thinking about his, the stories and his teachings specifically that involved relationship with the natural world. So, and I'm saying natural world, the complications with that language, but anyway, we're just going to accept those for this moment. Where, so in the Sermon on the Mount, in his great sermon, like he's directing people to learn from the plants and the birds, like as teachers, pay attention. These are your teachers, right? His ability to have a relationship with the water, so he's able to like calm a storm. right? So it's like, well, wait, no, what is that? So, right. So like traditional Christianity would say, well, he's the Son of God. That's, like, that's what that is, right? That's not us, right? But like, what if it's actually not just Jesus as the Son of God, right? What if it is revealing, what you've talked about a lot, Peter, as about animism as being a core piece that institutional religion has rejected. But of course, the only way that you can colonize a place or a people is to make them dead before you actually kill them. And so what if it's a revelation about the aliveness of everything? And I really see that as a place where Christianity is being rewilded, if people aren't using that language, right? Because I feel like there's a tremendous opening around animism within Christian circles, all over the place. So I think that's one of the pieces that I can point to for sure. How about you, Aric?
Yeah, when I think of Jesus as a rewilding figure, as a person to reflect on in terms of rewilding, I think of I'm actually grateful for the fact that he lives in an empire post, like, he is not like, it'd be one thing to say that we have this sort of like green man druid nature figure who just is calling us to this sort of like innocent relationship with a natural world that is he demonstrates this connection with nature and this belief in the value of nature, but he does so within the context of a civilization, mostly in cities, occupied cities, imperial cities, and he does so in a scrappy kind of way that says, stands with the people who are most on the underside of that story, and encourages them to do so in ways that are not just like, here's how you survive or get by, but here's how you actually dismantle this thing. Here's how you pull this thing apart. I think there's a reason why his story climaxes with being executed by the state, which is to say that they recognize that if people fundamentally adopt this overall ethos, this overall way of being, it's a threat to civilization. It's a threat to Rome's claim as being the ultimate arbiter of how people should live. And the threat is that he's essentially saying, like, hey, like, if we forgive all these debts, if we feed each other, if we do mutual aid, like, so that we're not dependent on systems of indebtedness in order to acquire our daily bread, then they don't really have any more power over us. And if they bring their armies and we don't raise an army in return, but we just sort of like find creative passive forms of resistance that like make the power of an army a moot point, then we don't have to participate in this. And hey, you see how Caesar raises an army with his taxes? What if we just said fuck money, like altogether, like, and just said like, like that wasn't a thing for us anymore? And that like, that's way more threatening than saying, I'm going to get a group of people and we're going to do this civilization thing better than you. We're going to raise an army better than you. And we're going to do this better than you, because he's actually he's inviting people to kind of opting out of civilization while still living within the boundaries of territory that civilization claims. Like, he doesn't say, hey, let's all flee away to another territory and get our own promised land. And he doesn't say, hey, let's conquer and take over and make ourselves at the head of the powerful institutions. He says instead, like, let's make an alternative society within the already existing society in a way that disrupts business as usual, like literally goes into the marketplace and overturns the tables and makes it impossible to do business as usual, and says that if we make business as usual impossible and just occupy this place peacefully, this project isn't going to last. Like this civilization thing, it's doomed. It isn't going to survive. It isn't going to be able to, it isn't the long-term solution for humanity in there. And just sort of like that doomedness of civilization is the good news. Like his good news to the poor is, by the way, Rome's fucked, which is like, that's an interesting sort of dynamic to sort of claim in the middle of it. And which I think is a way that rewilding is also good news, like saying to everybody, hey, the Wall Street is a dead end, and the Pentagon and the US military is a dead end, and fossil fuels is a dead end. That all sounds like dire, catastrophic proclamations if you're really invested in those institutions. But if you recognize the possibility for lateral forms of power, for community-based power, land-based power, a sense of like we can care for each other and we can meet each other's needs, all of a sudden the threat that those things will end isn't even a threat. It's actually a joyful reality, because you're like, oh, we could have peace and comfort and security without having to wage eternal war with all of our neighbors. That would be just better, just objectively better than our current circumstances. Like if I could have, fresh fruits and quiet life with my beloved people in my area around me, and never have to think or worry about the fact that some of my money and some of my time and energy and resources was going to drone bombing people in other places, that would be a better life.
Awesome. I keep having this, like, in going back and looking at some of these figures in similar stories, similar religions, and having this idea that that anti-civilization or anti-state, like the inherent anarchy of people, emerges from us, and emerges in particular people who become charismatic in their and powerful in the way that they can communicate these ideas, and eventually it seems like they all just get executed, and then their tale is spun in a different way by the state and used as propaganda for conquering more worlds, and it's one of the things that I fear actually the most about any such movement or idea, even rewilding, which is why I hate even giving it a name, in a sense, right? Like anything that's given a name is going to be taken. And you can already kind of see this in terms of some of the conservation rewilding that happens, where they remove people from their traditional lands so that they can have conservation zones. In the UK, there's actually, this is a huge thing with sheep farmers, because sheep farming is pretty destructive on a landscape, and there's not a lot of like viable land in the UK anymore in terms of like wilderness areas or areas that are less human impacted, or human impacted in ways that cause resilience and regeneration, right? So sheep farming is a very destructive process. However, the state is now all about rewilding there, because they're like, oh shit, we need to rewild stuff. So instead of like collaborating with sheep farmers and coming up with a new subsistence strategy that integrates the old with something new and becomes resilient and regenerative, they're just like kicking sheep farmers off of their lands and making them like eco-tourist sites, right? Or this is the fear, rather. In the United States, it would be similar with like eminent domain. And so you go in the countryside in the UK, and there's actually like signs that say rewilding with like a circle and a slash through it, right?
Oh, wow. Wow.
Super interesting to just kind of think about that. And so I'm curious, my sort of question to you is, do you have any thoughts around, because you're kind of on the other end of this, right? Like you're working within a story or a religion that's already been sort of used as that lever point. It's been 2,000 years since he, died. So what's the relationship there of like trying to leverage the story back against itself, that's been used by the state, and what are your where do you see successes with that happening? I mean, at the same time, I mean, because there's these churches that are closing down, right? Like you're saying, there's like a lack of maybe interest, or it's not, it's, I don't know what the whole story is behind the closing down of these things, but right. It's been so long. How do we like take the stories that people have grown up with in these particular fashions and then leverage them back in a rewilded way. That's I don't expect you to know the exact answer to that. I'm just curious what your thoughts are around those things.
Well, I could say that it's happening. There's no question about it. I mean, Catholic worker, right, is one example that persists. It just persists. Why and how does that persist? Like, that's crazy. Just on an online institute with Ched Myers, who was interviewed for Lisa Wells's book Believers, and the radical discipleship movement, and the whole 8 hours was connecting different groups of folks doing this around the country. So we've got Nelson and Joyce Johnson at the Beloved Community Center in Greensboro, North Carolina. You've got the Underground Seminary in Minneapolis with Jin Kim. You've got Todd Windward, in New Mexico with the Tilt movement. You've got Watershed Discipleship, right? You've got these places all over the place that are like, yeah, and they're typically underfunded, typically unrecognized, marginalized in different ways, typically all trying to figure out that, just like we all are, just like you are, Peter, like, how do I do this within this toxic culture, right? So live in and among, and critique at the same time, and open up these other sources of energy and vision for what else is possible, what else has always been possible. And that's been going on since the 3rd century.
Totally.
Right? I mean, since it was taken over, right? Desert mothers and fathers are just like, okay, this is not working. This is not what this was. We have to figure out how to maintain, and not maintain in like an institutional sense, but like save the seeds, right? It's like there's these seed savers, and the majority of white Christianity is all GMO, right? But there's seed savers, right? That are like planting, sowing seeds, saving them all throughout, and they look all different, which is totally the way it's supposed to be, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think with any movement, there's always that question of like, what happens if the movement, for the movement to succeed in its aims, it has to gain power. There's no way around that. Like, you have to gain power in order to succeed at your aims, and building. And power isn't a bad word. Power is something that you have to exercise power with love in order to be able to do anything. And so I think that like there's a sense of like, we need rewilding to become bigger than it presently is, in order for it to have the capacity to be transformative in a major way. But also, as a movement grows, and of course, there's, does it stay true to its aims? Does it dilute? But I think an even more fundamental question is that as it grows, it becomes increasingly susceptible to the seductions of the existing power system. The existing power system sees growing movements, and its overwhelming response to growing movements isn't actually to quash them, but to co-opt them, and to do so by offering access to power, by saying, here, we'll give you money, we'll give you a seat, we'll give you, we'll put you on a talk show, we'll make you famous, we'll do these other things. And there's always that temptation to see that as, as I think Eusebius in the 3rd century did for Christians, is like, oh, this is a chance for Christianity to transform the world, and saw it as, this is going to be where like the empire is going to become transformed by Christianity. But the thing to remember is that it does not, it never works that direction. It always works the other direction. I can't name the number of individual people I've known who've gone into working from the inside of an institution thinking that they were going to transform the institution, forgetting that the institution will exert just as much, or in fact way more power on them than they exert on the institution. that, like if you are entering into a power structure believing you're going to transform the power structure without thinking you're going to be transformed by the power structure, you're naive. And so to me, then, insofar as it's possible to have an antidote to that, the antidote to that is like a radical commitment, a loyalty to the underside that's expressed in concrete relationships. So like the groups that I think have succeeded in retaining their identity have had this core defining relationship that has made them. So for like the Catholic workers who we've mentioned a couple of times, it's the fact that like they're committed to working with like hungry and houseless and working class people. Like that is who they are. And as such, they've never been quite as susceptible to being pulled into larger power structures and transformed, because that would pull them out of relationship with the people who they've defined themselves as being with and for. And so with rewilding, I think there's a necessity to define ourselves in like integrally, of being in relationship with perhaps indigenous people and non-human persons, to ensure that if those are our core identities, that we can't so easily be tempted by access to wealth and power and money and institutions to be pulled away from it. And then if the power structures can't co-opt you, then ultimately they will try to quash you, which is the second phase of that. But, then it becomes a matter of, are we adaptable and resilient and survivable? Can we survive even when violent power is leveraged against us?
Amazing. Yes. I guess I have sort of one last question that's sort of a two-parter maybe. How do you see your practices transforming as the decline of civilization intensifies? And in that, how do you see it leveraging, how do you use Christianity or rewilding to leverage one another? Like, how do you rewilding Christianity through the collapse of civilization? There we go.
Wow, great question. Great question. I think one way that I can answer that is, what you said, Aric, about developing relationships and developing relationship with indigenous folks and the other than human persons. And one way that's happening here in Oregon is through EcoFaith Recovery, that Peter, I know you know about, is developing a deeper relationship with Ayla Hay Farm, which I think you also know about, now out in, why am I losing the name of where they are? It's out by Pacific University, Forest Grove. Oh, jeepers. Oh. Okay. It's out there.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yamhill County. Yeah. That's what it is. Yamhill County. Anyway, Randy and Edith Woodley. And Randy just published this I think, gorgeous book that's so powerful at this moment, called Becoming Rooted. And it's a 100-day immersion into Indigenous worldview, because it's a worldview shift, right? I mean, like you said, rewilding is a worldview, right? Totally. It's just a shifting of worldview. And I love this 100 days, right? Because it takes well, it takes longer than 100 days, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And one thing that I just finished and just came out, yay, is this companion book that I co-edited with Janet Parker. And it was basically 7 Christian identified people. And we wrote a daily devotion for every day of Lent but based on Randy's book and the themes of Randy's book. So we're actively making these connections. Like,
and
this
what's
is
the name
not
of yours?
different people. Ours is A Grounded Faith. And yeah, so just actively making that connection, just saying, you know what, what I think we thought of as Christian worldview isn't Christian. It's empire. And so this is an experiment in connecting Christian worldview with indigenous worldview and saying, oh, look at that. They're not incompatible after all. Imagine that. You know, which is like
Totally.
we're last to the party, you know, and figuring that out. But so, well, let me just say, so that's a piece. That's a piece. It's just that regular, as much as possible, growing practice of reconnecting animism, reconnecting with shifting worldview, right? Transforming worldview. And part of that transformation of worldview is just stop asking and answering the question, what can I do? There's no I left that matters, right? It's we. It's we. And yes, I have to show up to the we, right? But it's not, what can I do? It's not, that's not even a question. That's not a relevant question anymore about anything.
Mm.
How about you, Aric?
Actually, I think that's a great place to start and end, which is I think that if faith communities, Christian faith communities in particular, because that's my context, have anything to offer to the, like, you know, global collapse, like the conversation about how should we be and how do we respond to our, you know, situation where our society is collapsing and the ecocide is a real present danger and ongoing dynamic around us, is that sense of community, of the necessity of community. That's so much of what the you know, the way we're taught to respond to crises in our society is furthering of the underlying dynamic of crisis, which is that capitalism needs an atomized, alienated workforce. It needs people who are, you know, individuals, who are monads, who operate on their own. And in order to ensure that we stay that way, whenever capitalism creates problems, which is like its main thing that it produces, whenever capitalism creates problems, it also has to manufacture or market the solution to the problem as an individualized form of solution to the problem. You know, here you change your light bulbs, here you did the thing, because that keeps people in the capitalist mode in response to the problem. Even though capitalism is the reason for the problem, it's keeping you trying to solve the problem with the thing that caused the problem.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
so I think that this is something that, like, faith communities do have to offer, which is a counter narrative to this, which is that ultimately your individual approach to things is irrelevant. You know, like the faith asks you to accept that your life occurs in the context of the cosmos, of a greater reality than yourself, that it didn't begin at your birth and it doesn't end at your death, that you are a part of an ongoing narrative, an ongoing story that only accrues meaning insofar as it has value, as you give yourself in love and service to your neighbors. So that sort of like core narrative of Christian faith in particular is really potent in a time of collapse, because it's to say we're inviting people to come together to try to set aside their individualism for the sake of a communal good, and to trust in the idea that in this communal good, you know, we can realize a better reality for all of us in the process. You know, and Christianity, one of our core rituals is the practice of Eucharist, where at the table we literally break bread, we feed each other. And the idea at this table, one of the core ideas of this table, is everyone comes to this table as an equal, and everyone goes away from this table fed. No one is turned away, no one is rejected, no one is higher or lower, no one gets more bread and some get less. Like, we don't have, like, the table breaks down power structures and class structures. And the intent of this is to model the idea that fundamentally in community, we are interdependent, and our common good supersedes any individual good we might attain or achieve. And so that's something that the faith brings. But then I think that the church has been, so co-opted by structures of power and imperialism and stuff. And so, as part of that process of being co-opted, so spiritualized that we don't even realize that the bread is bread. Like, we're so invested in this idea of like a spiritual community that we miss the idea of just like planting a garden and feeding each other and like being literally grounded in the ground around us and the earth and air and sky and other creatures around us, and tending to that community away around us. So in a collapse, I think it's urgent for the church to recover the reality that like building community means literally like building. It means like growing food and making sure that the life that is around you is becoming more biodiverse, more rich, more that the impact that we leave on the planet and on our neighborhoods and stuff around us is a good one. Like, human beings don't have to be a force for destruction. We can just as easily, or maybe not just as easily, but we could, in the right circumstances, like be a cooperative, creative force that leaves an enriched, ecosystem behind us, and that is a way as well of expressing the value of a communal life. That our life extends beyond ourselves, even beyond our human community, to flourish and be realized, to be fully realized in the the legacy we leave in terms of cleaner air, better water, more diverse plants and animals, and more food-bearing plants and animals around us.
Awesome. Aric, I want to add something about the counter narrative, and just that. I mean, that's it. Like, that is fundamentally, I think, the most powerful gift that Christianity can offer. Similarly to rewilding, it's like it's a counter narrative, right? It is, it's ritual and song and language that at its best reinforces our connection to and trust in the God of life, like life with a capital L, right? That, like you said, like began, like what are we? We're just like a little blip, right? In this whole thing. And this whole civilization is also a blip. It feels giant, like it feels impossible, right? To counter, but it's a blip, like compared to life, compared to the God of life. And so, Christianity, like at its best, can it be that, right? Can it be just like regular reminders that's what we're part of? Like, we're on the side of life, right? We're on the side of life. And therefore, as Jesus says, do not worry. Do not worry. Right. And you've said the same thing too, Peter. Like, you have really helped me form a deeper faith, because you have talked about that, rewilding, or life, essentially life versus empire.
Totally.
Right? Life wins.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. It's like I'm reading through Rewild or Die right now, and the chapter of resistance versus rewilding is the next one coming up. And that's essentially where that main component is in that chapter. So I've been thinking about that a lot lately. Yeah, thank you both so much. This was fantastic. I really feel like we covered a lot of interesting and good ground. And I apologize for my boring questions that I initially sent you. I mean, I knew we would skirt some of that stuff in the conversation, obviously. So, thank you so much for coming on the show.
So grateful for the invitation, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Peter.
just fantastic. I love it. I love what you're doing. I love being
Mhm.
part of it.
Do either of you want to plug anything you're working on?
Oh, I already did, Aric.
You did plug
I
your
plugged
book.
my book, A Grounded Faith, and Randy's book, Becoming Rooted,
Yeah.
for sure. Both are super important.
No, nothing to plug today, but definitely
Cool.
look forward to more ways to be engaged, be connected.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome. Well,
All right.
okay, wait, can I plug one more thing?
Oh, yeah.
Actually, no, the community that I'm working with right now, the Levin community on 20th and Killingsworth and Salt and Light Lutheran Church. I would say that that is a community that's really, really trying to grapple with this, and has been for a long time, right? And continuing to try to grapple with how do we do this? How do we do this thing called community? How do we do this thing called Christian community in this context in a way that produces more life?
Awesome. Thanks for listening to the Rewilding podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guests and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe and support my work by of the Rewilding podcast at patreon.com/PeterMichaelBauer. And as always, you can help by writing a review on Apple Podcasts and make sure to share on social media. Thank you for listening. Until next time.